Soul Tribe. So today's topic is on dispelling the myth of the Jezebel archetype, but also explaining how it's linked to a Black woman's liberation, specifically my liberation. So what inspired this topic was a multitude of factors, but for the sake of time, I'll give you three. One, so on Facebook, and I know what you're thinking, I kept coming across images of Black girls with silk presses, age appropriate outfits, their favorite fruit flavored lip gloss and nail polish. And one image was of Blue Ivy Carter, actually. Anyway, these are all things that I enjoyed growing up as a Black girl, heavily influenced by the beauty and the fashion of 90s and early 2000s sitcoms and pop and R&B music videos. But some of the comments under these posts were disheartening. Accusations of these little girls trying to be fast, grown, or worse, promiscuous. And these comments lit a fire in me because I remember what it felt like to be called fast for innocently existing in a fully covered, petite, shapely body and having a little sass. God forbid a girl show a bit of confidence or shows that she's sure of herself at a young age. Side note, what's interesting is that I didn't even notice how my body was developing until the adults pointed it out. All right. I didn't know I had a shape until an adult said that I had a shape. So clock that. Anyway, the name Jezebel popped up on my YouTube algorithm, and it was one of those how to spot and avoid women with Jezebel spirits. I always heard the name Jezebel growing up, usually associated with sexual promiscuity, deception, and danger, but I had never read her story for myself. And then the third reason as to why this conversation popped up was because I had a flashback of myself in college. I was about 21 years old, probably like a junior in college. Shout out to CAU. I was called a Jezebel by a friend's mother for going to brunch in a silk tank top, a skirt, and heels. Her tone was dripping in shame, and she said it in front of her husband. So, no other time had she spoken to me like that. It was only when I showed up in a full face of makeup, a laid side part, and a hyper feminine outfit that she felt the need to project her unsolicited discomfort onto me. And she later apologized and she admitted that she was probably jealous, but that sting never went away. That sting of the ridicule stuck with me because here I am trying to be girly, trying to be feminine, which is now a damn trend, and I get demonized for it. I get called a Jezebel. Please. Anyway, so growing up, I had plenty of experiences that taught me it wasn't safe to be bold, to take up space, to be seen, or to be heard. From the classrooms and communities to corporations and boardrooms, over and over, I was ridiculed, criticized, and rejected. I learned to value belonging over authenticity and traded in my being for approval. Ultimately, I betrayed myself. After many failed attempts to assimilate into what was projected and expected of me, I came to a conclusion that no matter how much I dim my light, make myself small, lower my voice, and make others comfortable, I will always stand out. My presence will always make someone uneasy. I will never fit in because I was never made to. So I had to ask, who benefits from me playing small? Is it family, peers, colleagues, partners, programs, systems that rely on a woman's shadow and silence? Systems that survive off of the backs of quiet women who shrink, who apologize, who fold themselves into palatable shapes? Maybe it's the latter. I got tired of staying unseen and unheard based on the false promise that I'd be accepted if I just complied. But even after I abandoned myself, I was still rejected, still ridiculed, still criticized. So now we're here. The more I sat with these questions, the more I realized that my fear of being misunderstood, mislabeled, and cast aside, it didn't start with me. It's ancestral, it's historical. My story is just one thread in a much longer, deeper fabric of how powerful, visible women, especially Black women, have been punished for refusing to disappear. That punishment has taken many names over time, and one of the most enduring names, Jezebel. because she became a trope. Before she became a trope, a slur, a dog whistle in church pulpits and media headlines, Jezebel was a name, a queen, a foreigner, a political strategist. And yet history has rarely allowed her to be any of those things. Instead, she was flattened into a cautionary tale. So I began to read. I returned to the text for myself, not the sermons, not the commentaries. And what I found was far more complex than the harlot that we were warned about in church. So Jezebel's story spans just a few chapters in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, yet the impact of her character has echoed across millennia. According to the biblical text, Jezebel was a Phoenician princess, the daughter of Ethbaal, and she married King Ahab of Israel in a political alliance. As queen, she brought her religion, the worship of Baal and Asherah, into Israel, erecting altars and supporting hundreds of prophets dedicated to these deities. So Jezebel is most known for two major conflicts in scripture. All right. So the first conflict is religious. She actively opposed the prophets of Yahweh, having many of them killed, and directly clashed with the prophet Elijah, especially after he orchestrated the mass execution of Baal's prophets on Mount Carmel. Her religious influence over Israel and her bold challenge to Elijah positioned her as a formidable figure. However, she did what many kings would have done in an effort to sustain their traditions and faith. The second political, or I'm sorry, the second major conflict in scripture was political intrigue. And so in 1 Kings 21, Jezebel orchestrates the death of Naboth, a vineyard owner who who refused to sell his land to King Ahab. When Ahab sulks, Jezebel takes matters into her own hands, forging letters in his name to have Naboth falsely accused and stoned. And this act ultimately seals her fate. So Elijah prophesies that dogs will devour her body. A prophecy fulfilled in 2 Kings 9 when she is thrown from a window and trampled. So what's critical to note here is that the Bible represents Jezebel as a powerful, politically savvy, religious devout woman, but it does not depict her as a sexually immoral, seductive, or harlot. Her sins are deeply political and theological, not sexual. She is demonized for her religious defiance, her foreign identity, and her unapologetic command of power as a woman, not her body or sexual conduct. Yet when people bring her up in conversation, the heavy emphasis is almost always put on Jezebel's ability to stray men away from Christ via seduction, lust, and temptation. Even if she was solely demonized for her sexual immorality, which the Bible never actually accuses her of, wouldn't that put revered kings like Solomon and David in the same box? Because Solomon built temples for foreign gods to please his many wives, and David used his power to take another man's wife and have that man killed. It's still up in the air whether or not David received consent from the other woman. But, whatever. So, if that's the case, why is Jezebel demonized for an act she never committed? In Revelations 2:20 through 21, her name is mentioned one more time, this time as a symbol of the type of woman to be wary of, particularly in connection with fornication and false teaching. But this Jezebel is not the same woman we read about in 1 and 2 Kings. Still, this single verse has been used to reduce Jezebel's entire legacy to that of an adulterous harlot. Her story, which was once layered with politics and strategy and power, is now rewritten into a warning about seductive rebellion, stripping her of depth and casting her into infamy. And chronologically speaking, Queen Jezebel had long been dead by the time Revelation was written. So when the speaker in Revelation says, I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she's unwilling, it becomes clear that this cannot be the same Jezebel from 1 and 2 Kings. What we see here is a literary and theological repurposing of her name, no longer as a living queen, but as a symbol of seduction, rebellion, and moral corruption. Her legacy was hijacked, essentially. Her character becomes shorthand for danger, temptation, and disobedience, and yet nowhere in the Hebrew scriptures is Jezebel described as promiscuous, lustful, or sexually immoral. That narrative was superimposed, not sourced. This was a theological strategy, not an accident. So let's go on to the next section, which is talking about the Jezebel's roots in misogyny and racism, and how the label was weaponized against Black girls and women. So the name Jezebel didn't remain confined to ancient texts. It became a label, a slur, and a social weapon. Over time, it evolved with biblical references to a racist and misogynistic archetype disproportionately wielded against Black girls and women. This distorted image of a woman who is sexually deviant, manipulative, and morally corrupt was never supported by the actual biblical text, yet it became a convenient tool to justify the policing of Black femininity, desire, and visibility. From slavery to modern media, the Jezebel trope has been used to shame young Black girls for simply existing in their bodies, to dismiss the pain of Black women who experience sexual violence, and to rob an entire demographic of their right to innocence, softness, and agency. This will explore how the misreading of one woman's story birthed a legacy of harm that continues to echo through schools, churches, courtrooms, and comment sections even today. In the 2021 article, The Deviant African Genders That Colonialism Condemned, it goes over how all of this started in colonization in colonized Africa. So, according to Mohammed Elenium, in pre-colonial Africa, European anthropologists viewed African gender expressions, sexuality, and orientation as foreign, strange, and in need of investigation. Much of what they discovered was labeled as demonic, unruly, or immoral, not because it was, but because they couldn't understand or control it. Viewing women solely through the lens of objectification was not originally African. Contrary to popular belief, neither was homophobia or transphobia. These ideas were imported by European missionaries, colonizers, and anthropologists who arrived with rigid Christian and patriarchal values. Under colonial rule, binary gender norms, heteronormativity, and shame around sexuality and embodiment were not only normalized, they were legally enforced, violently punished, and morally shamed into the social fabric. Does that sound familiar? Moving on, I felt it was important to include the roots of transphobia and homophobia in this conversation because much like the in the 1500s, state legislators today continue to orchestrate moral panics, diverting attention away from governmental failures by scapegoating queerness. And instead of taking accountability for broken economic systems, crumbling education, and political corruption, blame is redirected towards the LGBTQ plus communities. And this mirrors how white enslavers refuse to acknowledge their own violence rather than opening up or owning up to the sexual assault and rape of Black women. They deflected responsibility by branding them as quote unquote Jezebels. Women and little girls who were asking for it and naturally more enticing and sexually advanced than their counterparts. They stripped these women and girls of humanity, reducing them to nothing more than portals and baby incubators, only to discard them as damaged goods once they were no longer deemed useful. White enslavers had to dehumanize Black women to justify such disgusting and demonic behavior. So, Laura E. Fox, 2022, explained that during the rise of photography and postcard production in 1889, the bodies of exotic African women were exploited for the European male gaze. So, what was once masked as scientific curiosity quickly evolved into blatant fetishization. The images often portrayed um, women as if they were willingly displaying themselves, but it would be naive to believe that coercion and domination were involved, especially considering the violent and volatile racial and colonial dynamics of that era. And these photos became so sought after that they fueled the creation of the, and I'm about to butcher this, the Harum colonial discourse, or the harem fantasy, which drove large numbers of European men to Africa in hopes of encountering an easy, loose African woman. When they realized this hypersexualized narrative didn't reflect African cultural realities, the result was an increase in sexual assault and rape committed against African women. Overall, this fictional narrative of the consensual, alluring, brazenly sexual African woman is what led to this still existing archetype of the hypersexual black woman seen in media today. This behavior did not end, and the archetype of the easy black woman contributes to black women being less likely to be believed when they do not report SA. Silenced twice, first by assault, then by the system. So that direct quote leads me to the next point. Um, so according to blackburncenter.org, SA and grape was still very common amongst black girls and women even after slavery and the Civil War in the 1960s. Those who committed the crime were not faced with much of any charges. This led to masses of women deciding not to come forward with their story for fear of being re traumatized by going through the justice system and the threat of their livelihood. So I want to do a reflection on the work of Nikki Kendall, who is the author of Hood Feminism. So before moving forward, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to honor the work of Nikki Kendall. Her book Hood Feminism, particularly chapter 4, hashtag Fast Tell Girls, was the catalyst that pushed me to think more critically about the intersections of race, gender, context, and the systems that shape our lives. Kendall's words offered language to feelings I had long held but had not yet named. It is because of thinkers like her that I began to weave politics, history, and humanity into my work as a healer, refusing to separate the personal from the systemic. In many ways, the seeds of this very reflection were planted through her unapologetic storytelling and sharp analysis. In her book, Mickey Kendall talks about the dichotomy of how being labeled a fast tail girl was meant to serve as protection, but ended up being oppressive as a means to govern black girls' identity, body, and sexuality. While it was well meaning, the approach is flawed for two reasons. One, it leans on the belief that doing age appropriate activities like talking to boys, wearing shorts, lip gloss, and straightening your hair is a sign that a girl is headed towards trouble. Two, it creates a false narrative that bad things can or won't happen to good girls, which also insinuates that black girls who simply like being girly and feminine, it makes them bad. Kendall goes on to share a stat from the Black Women's Blueprint in the Black Women's Health Imperative, and this is a direct quote from her book. 40 to 60% of Black American girls are sexually abused before age 18, and those girls are likely to be labeled fast tail retroactively by people who need to believe that what happened to them was their fault because they must have done something to entice a man's interest. The victims watch their abusers evade scrutiny and ultimately justice. The reality is that young black girls are not granted the privilege of just being able to exist in their bodies innocently. The responsibility of the predator almost always falls back onto the girl, whether it's questions about what she wore, how she acted, or her whereabouts. The assumptions are mostly coded in She should have known better. Instead of calling out perpetual cycles of harm and putting the accountability back on the offender. Do you see the common themes of how the one perpetrating violence is often coddled and protected? From European colonizers to modern day violent men of all races who weaponize their power, I aim to dispel the myth that black girls put themselves in harm's way by bringing light to the fact that actually black girls are disproportionately exposed to harm. This next section, I want to talk about reclaiming Jezebel from a womanist and liberation lens. For far too long, Jezebel's name has been weaponized, detached from historical context, stripped of complexity, and wielded as a tool for shame and control. Through a womanist and liberation focused lens, I seek to reclaim Jezebel not as a symbol of wickedness or moral failure, but as a misunderstood figure caught in the crosshairs of patriarchal, colonial, and racial narratives. Male kings of Israel were routinely condemned for their wickedness and faced historical erasure or brief judgment. Um, Whereas Jezebel was immortalized as a symbol of evil, reflecting patriarchal and xenophobic anxieties more than her actual deeds. Jezebel became a scapegoat, and not just because she worshipped Baal, but because she embodied what Israel's patriarchal structure couldn't contain, which was a powerful, sensual, foreign woman who refused to assimilate. It's easy to see how Jezebel became a scapegoat for Israel's downfall, but it's crucial to remember that her actions are a part of a larger pattern here. If Jezebel had been a king, some of her actions would likely be treated as strategic moves, just as other male rulers' actions were. In modern discussions, Jezebel's story has often been used to shame and vilify women who exhibit power, autonomy, or defiance against patriarchal systems. However, her story should be re examined in the light of the fact that much of her behavior mirrors actions by other kings in the Bible who did not face the same kind of demonization. This selective judgment based on gender rather than the actual content of her actions speaks to a larger theme of how women in power are treated differently than their male counterparts. In many ways, Jezebel represents the sins of an entire political system. She did not act in isolation. Her actions are directly tied to the broader social, political, and religious context of that time. If Jezebel had been a man in the same position, marrying for political alliance, introducing new customs, and consolidating power, would the demonization be as strong? I guess not. I think not. Her real sin here was being a powerful foreign woman who disrupted Israel's religious political structure. This reclamation is not just about rewriting history, it's about honoring the dignity, agency, and fullness of Black womanhood today. It's about restoring the right to exist in our bodies, our power, and our sensuality without shame or apology. We see how Black women with strong presence are negatively perceived in the media, from Kamala Harris and Beyonce to Jasmine Crockett and Megan Thee Stallion. A divine purpose has been put on my life to help heal others through liberation. I cannot fulfill this purpose staying silent and being timid. Loud, harmful narratives need to be met with roaring truth seekers, healers, and storytellers who can cut through the noise of podcast people who actually need to be in therapy and cognitive dissonance. I no longer wish to shrink, hide, and stay silent for the comfortability of others. Okay, I will not make myself small to be easily digestible. As the old saying goes, you can choke. I gained nothing from playing small, not even protection. Every second that I spent lighting myself on fire to make others warm, I suffered. And reclaiming the Jezebel myth, Black women have the power to actively reshape their narrative through art, advocacy, and everyday actions that affirm their autonomy, challenge harmful stereotypes, and demand their humanity be recognized on their own terms. So if being powerful, strategic, honoring my ancestral practices, challenging harm, and prioritizing my autonomy makes me a Jezebel, I'll proudly wear that label. So the question remains, who benefits from you playing small and what's stopping you from no longer giving a damn. All right. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope what I was saying brought back a lot of memories for you so that it could help you unpack how you may have been mislabeled or judged for being something that you're not. And I hope that you take this and you are empowered by reclaiming what was once used against you as a weapon. All right. So again, thank you for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. Have a good one.